to our mini Curious Minds talk this evening. And tonight we've got our very own Tim Haynes, who's going to talk about landscape photography. Now, Tim's an interesting guy. For those of you who haven't met him, he's the IT guru behind PSNS and the Photographic Society. For those of you who've been at the Curious Minds meetings in the Suter Theatre, you'll know that every time something goes wrong, then David or I or whoever running the meeting wave our hands in the air and we look for Tim to come and help us. So the society couldn't survive without Tim. I've known Tim for years now, ever since I came to Perth and joined the Photo Society. And at first he comes over as this rather oddball character, very quiet, very to himself. And I remember he gave a talk at the Photographic Society where his talk was, about photography, but it was all about tranquility, serenity, calm, and all of this Zen stuff. And I thought, that's really weird. However, since then, I've learned a lot more about Tim, and I've spent many long days, nights, and weekends off in the wilds doing photography with Tim. His approach to landscape photography is different from anyone else I've ever met. I call it thoughtful. And landscape photography, there's one approach is this. You pick a mountain, you pick your time of year, you wait for the right weather, you wait for the light, and click, you make a nice photograph. But Tim starts in a different way. He thinks about it from the point of view of the geology, what lies beneath the landscape. And he thinks about it from the point of view of the climate in a particular area and the land use and the history. It's a kind of holistic view of a place. Tim's going to explain all of this to you in great, great detail. But anyway, at the end of the day, one approach to landscape produces pictures with a wow factor. I've never seen a wow picture from Tim, but when I see a whole bunch of Tim's pictures together, I go, wow, now I get it, I understand it. And I like his photography very much. Questions? Could you please type them into the chat? And then at the end of the talk, Malcolm will go through the questions and we won't interrupt Tim during his talk. So anyway, over to Tim for landscape photography a la Tim.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for that glowing introduction, Tom. Hello to everybody. Good evening, and thanks for coming along. If you bear with me, I'll just get my screen share on the go. Here we are. Now, can everybody see that intro slide?
I can.
Excellent, thank you. Yes, this is based on a talk that I gave to the Photo Society, as you can tell, since I'm in the middle of January, and I've entitled it Landscape Photography Technique and Thoughts. This evening is going to be brought to you by the letter C, starting with C is for conventions. Beware of things that we should or shouldn't do. The first half of several halves is going to be technical considerations. As you can see here, we have a pretty landscape just along the road from here, taken sometime in this winter. And the EXIF settings that I told the camera to use to make it. We're going to start with the how. This is considering how the photography happens, the tools that we carry around as landscape photographers, both in camera and in head, so that we can, so that I can explain how I go about tackling a given photographic situation. This slide is to illustrate camera metering modes. The camera considers a function of the scene. And this function of the scene works in conjunction with the exposure mode. So in automatic and semi-automatic modes, this function of the scene that's highlighted in the viewfinder becomes a midtone. In manual mode, it shows where in the tone spectrum the given exposure settings would appear. So the camera can be examining a global average of the entire scene. It can concentrate on a small spot known as spot metering in the center of the frame. There's center weighted, where it's interested in a slightly larger zone of based on the center of the frame. And there's multi-zone or matrix metering, where it considers the entire frame, but rather than just a simple average, it does a little bit of complicated analysis to say, well, this looks like a landscape, it looks like a portrait, or something like that. I want to highlight at this point, there's a big difference between the philosophy known as get it right in camera, which is an erroneous thought process that for some people, that's where they think the photographic process ends. What I would prefer to say is get the camera bits right, because the camera bits are an essential part of an integrated flow from data capture when you're out in the scene to realizing the finished image through a certain amount of post-processing. With that in mind, this is a histogram. This is a continuation of the last slide on exposure. If the question here is, what does it take to place an aspect of your scene lighter or darker or in the middle of the tonality? So in this histogram, we have a spectrum from dark to light across the bottom, and vertically is a proportion of how much of the frame as a proportion is that degree of brightness. So if we're analyzing this scene of the tree down the road, this whole hump represents the darker parts of the landscape and the tree itself, and this half towards the right is brighter tones, and that's the smooth gradation of tonality in the sky there. So when you're out and about in the field, the exposure settings allow you to say, I want the sky part to be this bright, so shifted over this far right. I want the landscape to be at this position on the histogram. And the one thing that you really, well, the two things that you want to avoid at all costs is pushing the histogram so far right that the highlights blow out and they start crawling up the right side. And similarly, if you position everything too dark, then up this side of the histogram are dragons of sensor noise that will contribute to deteriorating the photograph. In this example, yes, if you walk across the road from that, then suddenly the light comes on and you get a gorgeous photo of a very characterful ash tree down at Frandy in Glen Devon with the autumn sunlight on. So it's your first nice photo of the evening. I need to spend some time discussing what's known as the exposure triangle. There are three critical parameters to gauging and controlling the exposure in a photograph. The most important one by far is the aperture, so the size of the hole on the front of the lens. And we can vary it. When it's bigger, you get more light in, and when it's smaller, you get less light coming through and the photo comes out darker. The consequences that go with this are when you have the aperture wider open, you get less depth of field, so not as much zone of focus where things will be sharp. So you'll get bokeh, which is the gorgeous blurry background images. You'll also get vignetting, where the corners of the frame start to get darker. On the other hand, if you stop down the aperture to use a smaller aperture, you get less light through, but you'll get a greater depth of field. And if you go too far, you'll get diffraction, so everything will look blurry. But if you get it just right, then when you've got a brilliant highlight like the sun coming through trees or a street light, then that diffraction will actually give you a nice set of spikes around the highlights. typically somewhere in the middle is a sweet spot of ideal sharpness for a given scene. That's the first consideration when walking up to a landscape and wondering what to do with it. The second consideration typically is ISO, which is not actually tied to reality. It's a function of the camera sensor, and it's the manufacturer saying, we want to brighten what's coming in just by multiplying it and by applying a tone curve. It has no significant effect other than if you amplify the incoming signal, it'll start getting noisy. And once we've got those two, so obviously you try and use a low ISO, typically around 100, just to keep things nice and smooth and get the best image quality. And once those two have sorted themselves out, the other interesting consideration is shutter speed. If you go for a longer exposure duration, then you get more light in, so the image comes out brighter, but the subject might blur. If you've got a tree blowing around like so in the wind, then with a longer shutter speed, you'll get more of that blur, and the leaves will look fuzzy. And similarly, if you're hand holding, then you might shake the camera more with a slightly longer shutter speed. Again, you get the choice of making this a creative decision. You can make the image darker just by choosing a quicker shutter speed, and you can freeze the subject motion where something that might be moving, typically say a car around a racetrack or something like that, you can make it pin sharp just by choosing a really fast shutter speed. These three things work together in harmony. You either, when you're choosing a combination of all three parameters at once, quite often you walk up to the scene and a method of handling it will suggest itself. You'll say, right, this thing has an obvious subject that I want to focus on, nothing else that matters. I can choose a wide aperture, get lots of light in, concentrate everybody focusing on the one subject in the field. My ISO can be lower because of that, and my shutter speed can be higher, so avoiding the assorted motion blurs. That's one decision. Or you can go completely the other way and say a given scene lends itself to a very long exposure. Say you've got clouds moving across or water flowing nicely or something like that, and you want that to blur out, to become an area of simplicity in the photo. So your guiding consideration then becomes shutter speed. Let's make that a long exposure. What do I have to do to the aperture and the ISO to realize that and maintain the right overall exposure level? Moving swiftly on to focusing. In this illustration, we have three variations of the two parameters that we can control. There's the overall focus distance from the camera out to the subject, so that can vary. And there's the aperture that we can use. In this case, I've chosen to identify either f5 or f16. The green line here illustrates the zone in reality that will appear to be sharp when you've taken a photo that's focused at that distance and using that aperture. So to a crude approximation, there's approximately twice as much focus zone beyond the designated focus distance as there is in front of it. That's very crude, but it's a good thing to remember at times. The depth of field increases as the aperture reduces. So as you go from f5 to f16, keeping the focus distance the same, your green zone of things that will be sharp extends massively. And the depth of field increases as the focus distance increases. So as you move from that number of trees away from your camera to that number of trees away, you gain extra depth of field as well. There's a trick known as hyperfocusing, which is where you decide what aperture you want to use for various other reasons. You take the furthest distance away that aperture will give you, and you move that so that becomes infinity. On a nice old manual lens, you would have markers for the purpose. And you could say, if I move the distance scale around, then my furthest f16 or my furthest f5 lines up on infinity. And by doing that, you're making the greatest use of the depth of field. There's no point in letting this green line overrun beyond infinity. That's nonsensical, and it means that you're losing the potential for close focusing. So you can gauge this fairly delicately to get just the zone of things in focus that you want. So this is an illustration of a scene not too far away from here, near just outside Crieff. Looks suspiciously like a line of trees leading away into the distance. This is shot at f5 on a fairly sunny afternoon. This was shot at f16. If I toggle back, then you can just see that tree there is getting a little bit blurry, and things are definitely.
I'm not getting the pictures.
Is anybody else not getting this? Malcolm has problems. What photo did you last see?
The diagram of pine trees and 3 cameras.
So you have this one?
That's the diagram.
That's the diagram. So if I click next again, do you have a line of trees now? Actual trees?
No.
That's looking reasonable to me. Tom's shaking his head as well. I don't know what's wrong with that. Do you have this comparison of the edges of 2 lines of trees now? Nothing. I'm going to stop my screen share and restart the share.
Yeah, that big plan.
Are we now seeing my screen again?
No. Just a blank.
This is odd. How about now? Still.
No.
We have technical issues, I'm afraid. It looks like it's sharing to me just fine.
Yeah. Under advanced sharing options, there's who can start sharing when somebody else is sharing. Ah.
I just stopped. Did you get anything there?
No.
Nothing. It's very odd. Advanced sharing options. No.
I'll tell you what, shall I try sharing my screen and see if that works?
Yes, please. Okay, that's fine.
Okay. So it would appear to be something at your end, I think, Tim.
That's strange because it's been working so far, I take it. Right. Portion of screen.
Yeah, we've got the trees again.
Excellent.
Diagrams.
Okay, sorry about that. Do you now have actual trees?
Yeah, we do. I do.
Excellent.
I can go back to sleep.
Thank you very much. Okay, so this is an actual photo illustrating shooting trees, rather similar to that diagram at f5, and moving swiftly on. Where am I? There we go. The same scene as f16. You might not notice much of a difference via zoom. So here's the comparison of those two side by side. And if you look at, say, the sharpness of these last trees at the end of the avenue there, that's very blurry on the left at f5. They are somewhat sharper at f16 there. Other things have changed. The lighting, there were clouds scudding overhead, and so the lighting has changed, and there's greater contrast in the leaves there, even just in a split second or two between frames. So sometimes a given scene dictates how it wants handling. Sometimes it can be best to experiment and take a handful of variations, see what stands the test of time, that you want to look at it again in a week or a month or so down the line. The last of three technical areas that I want to consider is composition. And I'm going to choose to define composition as the mapping of structure from the real world scene to the photographic frame. So here we have an obvious structure, the side of a mausoleum with some gravestones around it. Obviously the frame is the photo that you're seeing. You can bear in mind lighting and visual weight. Things are regarded as heavy if they are areas of darkness. So the shadow zones in the wall here would be heavy, and visually speaking, the lighter tones here are lighter and more delicate. It's important when choosing a composition to think about edges. So the very edges of the frame where you start and stop with your photo, about balance. So placing things nicely, 1, 2, 3 in the frame with a reasonable separation in between the subjects. I could have moved myself lower, and this gravestone would overlap with that buttress on the side of the mausoleum, which might be regarded as inelegant. All these are decisions. There's not much you can do about composition apart from cropping it afterwards, so best get it right at the scene. So that's us done for tools. We have our camera, an understanding of exposure, focus, and composition. And so let's move on to some examples. Can I just check you're now seeing some nice light and shade of a woodland path? Thank you very much. So illustrating some techniques here. This is a conventional landscape. C is for composition. It's all about structure. It's about the lines in the frame, the shadows cast by the trees, and the brilliant light, and particularly the dark. I said tonight is brought by the letter C. C is for constraint. Sometimes, not always, but sometimes it can be beneficial to just fling a 50mm prime lens on the camera and go for a walk in the woods. You have to be in the mood for such a thing, knowing that you won't get the kinds of shots that you would with any other lens, but it can be liberating to just walk around with a fixed prime lens and see what parts of the scenery fit and that you can make a good composition out of. Another example, the same place, the same walk, the same day, as it happens, a conventional landscape, or it's all about the composition, the structure, the lines, the shadows, the light and dark, the leading into the distance along the path. And again, C is for constraint. Another trick is to shoot with the camera set to black and white, so you're not distracted by the colors when you're shooting, and you can just see the structure of the scene. It has the advantage that the camera will store the color data if you're shooting in raw mode, but you can take it home and you know that there's at least one valid way to process it. You can always get a black and white out of it because you shot it knowing that you'd transformed it to black and white in camera, so it'll work in post-processing as well. The other constraint that's quite useful is to shoot in a 16:9 aspect ratio, which is the same as most televisions and a lot of places. Again, the camera will probably store the full frame at 3:2, so taller, but you know when it comes to processing it, you have a valid way that will work, that you can always get a 16:9 out of it because that's what you put in the first place. Another conventional landscape. This is about composing by areas. So we have an area of trees, triangular at the top. We have an area of water, approximately triangular at the bottom, both of which are pointing your eye into the waterfall in the middle to keep you concentrated on the obvious subject. I'm going to blame another photographer as an influence, a chap called Tom Ang. I have a couple of his books. I have a great respect for his words, but actually a lot of his photos leave me stone cold. But one of the things that he said is balance. So a lot of the time when I compose in my work, I will deliberately offset this area of the frame. I will know that that's a triangle up there, and I will know that this is a triangle down here at the time I'm shooting it. And I want to set those two things off against each other. I might do it diagonally, something in that corner, something in that corner. I might do something in that corner and nothing in this corner, but I'm playing parts of the frame off against each other. So we move into the second of several halves of my talk. This is where the peep show starts, and we start thinking about what I choose to shoot. So some of my favorite subjects. This is obviously a conventional landscape. It's all about the color. Schiehallion with the sun setting behind me from the shores of Loch Rannoch looking across to the mountain. That beautiful red light on the top of the mountain there. And again, I'm going to blame another photographer as an influence here, our very own Mike Bell in the Photo Society, who once said, if you like it, put a frame around it. So walk around through the landscape, and if something catches your eye, it's good as a subject. Another conventional landscape, going to a place up here in the middle of Glen Lyon, playing with time and distance and depth. So making a nice silvery black and white out of it. There's about 20 minutes worth of data has gone into blurring the clouds moving through the scene in that sky there. And obviously the sense of distance, there's something near, middling and receding away into the distance. So that's a conventional landscape. I think we all know the praying hands of Mary in Glen Lyon, so there we go. But I like it there. This is a conventional landscape, and it's an example of minimalism. It was on the shores of Loch Rannoch one autumn morning. It's conventional, and I want to warn about fads and trends in landscape photography. It's all very nice being minimalism, making minimalist photos, but what does it say about you or your viewers or your opinion of them if you think they can only appreciate a scene with two rocks in it and nothing much else? It's just minimalism. It doesn't require meditation on the mysteries of suffering, supernovae, and mushrooms to understand it, unless it does. So, another conventional landscape. In his introduction, Tom said I shoot calm and serene scenes, and it doesn't get much calmer than this. Loch Rannoch in Glen Etive, early on a summer's evening a few years ago now. Everybody loves a reflection. The light moving over the mountains in the distance over Bokeh Moor and Bokeh Beck. It was beautiful. I spent quite a while sitting there just admiring it. This is another conventional landscape. It was the same morning as the minimalist photo, again on the shores of Loch Rannoch, with the mist passing by, looking across to the other side of to the loch, enjoying the mood, definitely in making a very atmospheric photo here. The compositional consideration in this one is vertical, breaking the frame up into 3 vertical stripes. There's, roughly speaking, as much fog and mist and cloud over there as there is water down in the bottom of the frame, as there is height of the frame dedicated to the trees in the distance. One consideration is the idea of the role of a subject in a photograph. If you were to look at this and say, what is the subject? There's no one thing that might stand out, but it is the mist, it is the swirl of the mist there, it's the turbulence, the blurriness of the trees in a fairly long exposure, and the hints of color. Those are all part of the same subject, but the subject of this photo is the atmosphere and the mood of that morning. Again, another conventional landscape. it's my kind of a mood. Sylvan in Assynt, from a very well-known viewpoint. We'll come back and see this one again later as well. But that was, again, a few years ago, fairly early one morning, the sun rising and this beam of light hitting the side of the mountain, with gorgeous colors everywhere. Another of my moods, I do intimate landscape, close up, where you don't get to see the full context around it. In this case, we're playing with time again, doing a very short exposure of the Altmore waterfall in Kinlochrannoch. So as you can see, all the spray and turbulence is frozen into a moment in time, a very split second, something like 1,000th of a second, to get that effect. This is my nice place. Everybody should have a nice place. And this is one of my favorite moods. There is sepia tones on an autumn morning. Get up at 3:30 in the morning and drive through the rest of the night to get there in time for the sunrise. It's just glorious, and I love everything about that place. Another conventional landscape, don't worry, we'll get to the end of conventional landscapes, but sooner or later. Citing another influence, a very well-known photographer, David Ward, who has a theme, a message, saying, don't just take a photo of a thing, make a photograph where or in which something happens. So in this shot, what's happening is the water is flowing fast, the rock is flowing rather slower. But the two things are set in opposition, splitting the frame more or less in two. There's the water half and there's the slower rock half. There's a tree just heading out in this corner of the frame. There's a kind of a visual anchor. It's darker. It anchors your eye, keeping you concentrated on the lovely rock and the water going past. Another of those intimate landscapes, the difference a few seconds makes, recompose, the same Altmore in Kinlochrannoch. Again, it was a cold winter's day when I shot this. The light was blue and dull and fading, and so we have that absolutely freezing the motion. By way of contrast, another intimate landscape up at the River Afric, by the River Walk through Glen Afric. This is obviously a very close-up view halfway across the river, but I'm deliberately playing with time again, making a very long exposure so that the water has had time to flow through the frame, making this cloud of white abstract shapes and simplifying the areas. So it's the complete opposite, where the last couple of shots have been very, very quick exposures. This was a second or two for the water to flow that fast. And another kind of conventional landscape that I've noticed people doing is what I'd call a contrived conjunction. So the letter C is getting a workout tonight. Go to a particular place like Dunnottar Castle, find an event, normally astronomical in nature, and make a photograph in the pitch black where you can't see what you're doing. But that is the full moon rising on Halloween in the distance beyond Dunnottar Castle. So definitely atmospheric in some ways. Blue hour as a time of day to go shoot. I find it more interesting than what's known as the golden hour, so just after sunset. This was a completely unplanned coincidence, this shot. I was walking around the Knock of Crieff, rounded a corner and found the full moon rising pretty much smack between the eyeballs, so obviously I had to make a photo of it. We move on to my kind of landscape, things that I see differently, that Tom was saying I've done with the convention. We're starting to get a bit more personal here. Again, put a prime lens on the camera, go for a walk in the woods, just fill the frame with shapes, lines against the areas of crazy colors. So the complete antithesis of minimalist photography, fill the frame with complexity. That said, this is a delicate balance with its leaning italicized angles. A rotation round slightly left or right would be a radically different image. The way I've chosen to stop the frame there and start it over here, things would be very different with even a smallest adjustment. Another of my kind of landscapes, putting on a 100 to 400 millimeter telephoto long lens and go for a walk in the woods, in this case, the Black Woods of Rannoch. fill the frame with shapes, lines, areas, and crazy colors, and just let the light flare. The sun is just out of the frame up here somewhere, casting a brilliant light through the trees. So this is all about the light, the glowing colors in the background, the blur, lots of nice juicy blur, the straight lines, the diagonals, and the triangles that you get from that. And if there's only one thing that could possibly be called a subject here, it's that little cobweb. Everything else is context in this shot. Another of my kind of landscape. This one was around Canole Hill. It's just an interesting, well, I thought it was an interesting shape. This sort of wishbone curve of a young tree beside the track. And another of my funny places, in the depths of the Blackwoods of Rannoch, about 10 yards away from the path through the woods, lies this tiny little burn with a tiny culvert joining it. I happen to like this. I think it's a shot of 3 areas. There's the left third, the right third, the bottom third. There's a long exposure to blur the water. I just happen to like that scene. We're getting to the end of my choice of moods here. This one I've entitled Travelling Home for Christmas. It's just outside Auchterarder, looking along the railway lines to the west towards Stirling, with the snow fallen covering the ground and still falling. It's all so blue and cold and makes you shiver to look at, with the exception of the stripes of red on the signal post. So if that doesn't connote travelling home to Christmas, I don't know what does. And the last of my personal landscapes for a little while, up at Glen Affric, fall through a place, love it, return often, appreciate it. It'll never be the same place twice running, so accept it and appreciate it anew every visit, every season. So, transitional frame, something green for you to be looking at. Can I just check you have a green bunch of conifers? Thank you. Everything up to this point has been chosen for its aesthetic merits, but it doesn't always lead to an optimally healthy mentality. I used to worry a lot about driving versus being driven. So the use of mapping, ephemeris, and weather tools to plan a photo in great detail. But when you get there, the weather conditions aren't playing ball. So what makes for the better photo? One that was planned in inordinate detail, or the one that came about from reacting to the circumstances as they panned out? Which is the better way to work? To force the issue and risk going home saying you've not got anything on a given day, or to just roll with it. And these days, I'm more inclined to go with the flow. By all means, I will use maps, weather apps, and ephemeris apps, but I'm under no illusion that guarantees a particular photo that I might have wanted. I just know that I'm using them to stack the odds in my favor, that the weather conditions will generally be right. And if I wait long enough, the light will pass through the scene in a way that looks good. Whether it's exactly the way I had in mind or not, doesn't really matter. Light, form, and complexity are fine. So analyzing the scene in terms of its light and its shapes. But a lot of landscape photographers put the photography before the landscape, and you risk mistaking getting lucky with the shooting conditions as though that was something to take credit for, or even as a component of your style, which is, in my view, not a healthy way to go. I would much prefer to start putting the landscape first. We're often told that a photograph should tell a story, but in my mind, we have to be careful about this. Such a story is not a glib add-in or a trivial statement. You don't just put a person in a red jacket along the line of the path, so there, standing there, leading into the distance. That doesn't make the shot interesting. If you want to make that sort of a shot interesting, tell me what product of evolution leads us to perceiving red as outstanding, as dangerous, so that the jacket has to be that color in order to perpetrate that particular cliche photo. So this brings us to why, the third half of my talk. I want to be far more about, well, anything beyond just nice pictures. Pleasant as that might be, my stories are bigger than that. I imbue my photos with big themes. I use contrasts, things like near and far, fast and slow that we've seen with water and rock, sky and earth, mankind and nature. So we are the PSNS, aren't we? We're going to start with a little step back. This is all about the environment. Some background thoughts. On such occasions as I dip into the popular press, I see discussion about some mythical the environment. But I come away with a subconscious feeling that everybody regards it as a nebulous elsewhere, an evasive ultima thule, ever always beyond your wit to recognize, which does nothing for the morale of those who would seek to improve our interaction with this, the environment. So let's bring that back to Earth and ponder the simplest thing that you can quantify about the environment. Do you know how big the environment is? To pick a number, 50 billion cubic kilometers. That's how big the environment is, from 100 kilometers up in the atmosphere down to about ground level, give or take a gold mine. In that volume, every form of life we know, from the highest flying insects caught in an aeroplane engine intakes to the deepest gold miners, to every mother and father, hopeful child, inventor and explorer, every teacher of morals, every corrupt politician, every superstar, every supreme leader, every saint and sinner in the history of our species lives there on a mote of dust suspended in a sunbeam. Thanks to Carl Sagan for the poetic quote. So this, as you can see, illustrates the environment from top to bottom, complete with sunbeams. So I'm inviting you to come with me for a stroll. We'll start in the woods, pick up a metaphorical camera, and we'll record the experience together. We'll start in the middle, wander around a bit, and hopefully not fall over too much. This section is all about learning. One of the reasons for picking up the camera is, having picked up the camera many times over in the past 20 odd years, and pointed it at things that are interesting, I learn. So I've entitled this shot, "The Spark That Started Life." That's not a chronological statement, but chemically, this is the transition where inorganic becomes organic, where fungi extract nutrients from the minerals in the rockery beneath. Learning about trees some more. Trees have a distribution in Scotland. On the west coast, you get the Atlantic rainforest, with a predominance of oak and birch and pines. So here we have a bunch of trees by the roadside in Inverore on a dusk on a winter's day a couple of years ago. So as you can see, the light is cool blue and dull, very atmospheric. But the thing to note is that the trees are birches over there, mostly with a couple of pines and nice things. Continuing learning about the distribution of trees, on the east coast, so over at Ethy in Angus, we have predominantly beech, and one very small, gorgeous and well-loved dog that has somehow got in the frame there. Learning more about trees, human interest, tree lore, Rowan Trees. This is again up in the Blackwoods of Rannoch, but the European rowan has a long tradition in mythology and folklore. It was thought to be a magical tree and give protection against malevolent beings. British folklorists of the Victorian era reported the folk belief in apotropaic powers of the rowan tree, in particular the warding off of witches. Sir James Fraser in 1890 reported such a tradition in Scotland, where the rowan tree was often planted near a gate or front door. I can't say it's worked out too well here. I noticed this clearing in the Blackwoods of Rannoch, and there's a line of stones, well, two lines of stones, forming a 90-degree bend here, which are the crumbled walls that all remain of a small farm building of some sort from centuries ago in a small clearing in the woods. The building is long gone, but the trees remain. So much for that belief. Now, I need to show you a bit more of this screen. Here we go. Learning about trees. This is a yew tree near Kippen, outside Stirling. Two things about them. Yew trees are toxic, like nobody's. The only safe bit to eat is the red flesh of the berries around the seeds. Everything else is chock full of a couple of offensive taxine compounds with terminal consequences. It's been known as a suicide option since Roman times. And throughout the Middle Ages, folks who made longbows had shorter life expectancies from handling yew wood. So not nice stuff. The other thing that yew trees do to great characteristic effect is that they layer. So the tree sticks out a limb that hits the ground, catches and takes root, and becomes another trunk, forms its own branches, and that sticks out a leg, hits the ground, and the process repeats. So you get this circular pattern, and they certainly look funky beasts, quite characterful trees, while they're busy layering their way around the landscape. Even more crazy, beech trees are also capable of layering, but very, very rarely. There are only 5 known specimens in the UK that have exhibited it. And this one is an absolute monster. You can see in the distance, for a sense of scale, that's the single lane road wending off into the distance. The bole of the tree to about there is about as tall as me. And we have this whacking great beam of a branch coming out, and you can see it taking root and forming another beech tree. I wouldn't want to meet that one on a dark night. Bad enough on a misty afternoon. So these are all crazy things that you learn about trees just by being interested enough to pick up a camera and go for a stroll. Continuing the theme of why, transitioning slightly more, looking down a bit, being open-minded and alert. I spotted a small landslide in the local woodland last autumn, and I got to thinking, you can probably work out how long ago this slippage happened by, pardon me, 2 things. The amount of leaves that have fallen is the same as everywhere else, so some weeks prior, I should think, and enough time that people have established an alternative path around the slippage. But either way, being alert, spotting something unexpected in the woods. Continuing the theme of why pick up the camera and go look at the landscape? This is at Gavan Point outside Stonehaven. Behind me is approximately Norway, but we're looking due west along the lines of the Highland Boundary Fault into the distance. It runs right through this headland. Now, a couple of years ago, Tom and I were sitting on a cliff down, I think, up the road from here, and Tom was asking me, so do you know where the Highland Boundary Fault emerges exactly around Stonehaven? So I went and looked it up on the map, and I found this spot, and I've returned several times in increasing interest to study. So that's Stonehaven Golf Course, off to the right there. That way is the Highlands, that way is the Lowlands. Let's get up a bit closer. This is within the previous photo. This is still within the Highland Boundary Fault. This is in the damage zone, it's called. So we have dramatic, crazy, twisted and warped shapes of samite right in the danger zone with the fault running through the frame here. 1 minute you're talking with Tom on a cliff top, the next minute you're flying the drone, looking at the overview of the scenery. The next minute you're back with your regular camera and tripod. Actually, I think Tom was beside me when I shot this photo. And the 4th moment, you're back at home watching a YouTube video of the BGS where some lady's making a PhD out of studying this kind of rockery and analysing depths and temperatures at which the various forms of rock were formed. So the third photo about the Highland Boundary Fault, I've got in even closer, slightly behind where I was standing for the last shot. This scene is about 1 metre across, as you can imagine, and I've got right in there, deep inside the fault, right in the damage zone, to within centimetres, looking at the transition from lowland to highlands. The lowlands are characterised by sandstone. In the highlands, you typically get samite, which is partly metamorphosed sandstone. And in the middle, you get a greenish, slightly carbonized serpentinite and microgabbro. So this one, because I like it and I thought it was quite dramatic by my standards, I've actually had it printed 1 metre wide on my lounge wall above the telly. I think the desires I have once photo is printed tells you that, yeah, it's a good guiding criterion. Shoot in order to populate your own lounge wall with good photos. Keeping it geological, this is back up at my nice place. And a couple of years ago, I was around there and flying the drone. And I realized everybody comes and, well, my first photo was taken over there. Everybody comes and stands along here by the memorial, walks out a little bit onto one of these hillocks and takes a photo along Loch Afric to the bottom of the frame. What I never realized from just walking around the landscape directly is that these hillocks are glacial moraine. And again, having found this, and it was only because I flung the drone up and took a few photos that I suddenly recognized this hillocky pattern. So I went home and did my research. And again, there's another lady who's done a study into glaciation coming from Kintail behind. So it is a thing. Moving onwards, back to the letter C and the intimate landscape. C is for care. We're back in the Blackwoods of Rannoch. Just because a formerly glorious Scots pine tree is dead with bits falling off, doesn't mean it's not taking its place in the cycle of life, providing rotting material for all kinds of living creepy crawlies and fungi. So this is another of my messages, is learn, but C is for care as well. Continuing the new theme of care. This is out in the West Coast. It's West Coast woodland at its best. It's a reserve of the old Caledonian forest that used to cover Scotland. It's at Glen Nant, just outside Tynholt in Argyll. And it houses a secluded ancient rainforest full of wildlife and history. The oak, birch and hazel woods are a delight to walk through, spotting mosses and lichens, some of them quite rare. Sadly, this is taken along a thing known as the Ants Trail, but sadly there are information boards pointing out how the trees were felled in the 18th and 19th centuries to fuel the charcoal and iron smelting industry just across the mouth of Loch Etive at Banor. And as if that wasn't stupid enough, in the 1970s, the Forestry Commission, as was, planted non-native spruce all around the area as well. Since then, they have fortunately embarked on a strategy of removing the non-native trees, and the area has been designated as an NNR, National Nature Reserve. Keeping it photographical, I've had it in mind to make a photo here for some years, with the varying depths and distances and the path leading away over this tiny little bridge over the burn into the distance. I used a different technique known as Bokeh Panorama. You shoot a wide aperture prime at a fairly long focal length to get a narrow depth of field. So the drastic blur there and in the foreground, concentrating your eye on this one plane of distance intersecting the bridge. And then you use a panorama stitching around to build up the field of view that you wanted. It took 26 frames stitched together to get that effect. My kind of landscape, we're back up at the nice place, some of the trees that we were flying over earlier. This is all about subtle softness of tone, the gentle, cool end of the day, the sky turning a bit blue over the last hints of the sun in the distance. I'd like to continue the idea of care into ethics. Landscape photography for me is not a one-way street. There are plenty of people who will run landscape workshops and courses, making money from tours to see the scenery and help you use your camera when you get there. But I don't think the story should end there. When the landscape gives so much pleasure and joyful experiences, how can we give back? And if nothing else, find a charity or two and support them. Find a way to support and preserve the places that you love. This is learning and caring again. In this one, it's just outside Moothil. The thing to learn about is atmospheric optics. We've learned about trees themselves. We've learned about geology a bit. This is the optical properties of the atmosphere, so an optical phenomenon. The shades of sunset have the Earth's shadow in this deep blue, and a thing that's known as the belt of Venus, where the setting sunlight is refracted through the atmosphere and it comes out pink and purple. When we landscape photographers get it right, we get it right. Care would be noticing that the main branch here to the left of this magnificent tree has rotten and blown down since I took this photo. I went back months later, had another look, and the whole tree was disfigured. We notice these little things, these little changes. Whatever our favorite scenes are, we watch the changes from season to season, from year to year. And that's a form of care. And that's being maximally human, to notice this sort of thing. Learning and caring again. This is a strange phenomenon known as noctilucent or night shining clouds. They are the highest flying clouds in the atmosphere, about 76 to 85 kilometers of altitude. And typically throughout the summer, throughout the winter, you get aurora looking north. Throughout the summer season, you get these NLCs, noctilucent clouds, and they take the form of this electric cold blue, glowing, shimmering shapes, all these sort of walls and waves and patterns. They've only really come to prominence over the course of the last 200 years. Prior to that, they were rare to non-existent. And a couple of years ago, a study was released that showed a correlation with climate change and consequences for the ozone layer, that showed that there was a distinct, very strong correlation, probably even a causation relationship, that the more we're seeing these, it's a canary, that we should be alert to climate change. We're moving on to the last section of my talk, moments of awe and wonder, the memories that I keep. This one, it's called Asperitas because that's the name of the cloud formation. The Cloud Appreciation Society recently forked the name off from something that was known as Asperitas undulatus. But all this storm cloud, this undulating curve, the story here, it's about power, as if that wasn't obvious. But mankind produces pylons, nature comes along and rains on them big time. I have never had such a trouble driving the car through such a rainstorm as when I rather foolishly went underneath these. And this was just outside Perth, beyond Broxton at Windy Edge. There's a very well-known tree in landscape photography circles, and it's standing literally just beyond the edge of the frame to the left there. But point the camera a slightly different direction, you see this wonderful cloud formation. It's utterly awesome. And get that photo with its story of mankind versus nature. And the sheer drama of it is incredible stuff. I said we'd return to Sylvan. I was up a wee hillock beside the lay-by. Tom was beside his car in the car park at the bottom of the hill. This was a couple of November mornings ago. Moments of awe and wonder, otherwise known as if you drag your butt out of bed early enough in the morning. This was 9:30, having been there for an hour and a half already. The sun rose as it did in the previous photo from over there, worked its way round and is hiding behind that bit of cloud. So obviously the mountain itself is casting this dramatic shadow across the entire landscape. And that little spot there is not dust on your monitor. That's a golden eagle that flew straight out of the frame at us. Again, wonderful. Penultimate photo for the evening. Another moment of awe and wonder. This scene has a lot to be said for it, in terms of things that you might know about nature. We've got fluid dynamics going off here at the bottom. This is the outflow of the River Afric into Loch Benavian. And you can see the obvious channel shape. It's leading out in this V, which shows that the river bed follows a V shape where the center is flowing faster. If we look around, then in the distance, we have more glacial moraine. If we spin around this way, we get to see the river flowing from Loch Afric. So that's, most people go and stand, as I said, over here somewhere and take the photo along the length of the loch like that. I flew above it instead. You get to study the distribution of trees, the sparsity or the density that they prefer to live at on hillocky glacial moraine like this in a proper Caledonian forest environment. And if you look up this way, we have a very faint fog bow, another atmospheric optic phenomenon. So as I say, this photo has everything. And that's the glacial moraine hillocks from a different angle that I was talking about earlier. Last photo. Karst landscape, otherwise known as Crochen Lochen. It's a kind of terrain characterized by barren, rocky ground, caves, sinkholes, underground rivers, and the general absence of surface streams. It results from the excavating effects of underground water on massive soluble limestone. If you look down at a map of a karst landscape, it's a crazy interplay of almost equal areas of blue water, lumpy rockery, blue water, lumpy rockery. I started the why part of my talk by inviting you all to pick up a metaphorical camera and come along with me. I'm hoping that I've opened your eyes in awareness of our surroundings, to the planet's beauty and to what can be studied and learned from it and how we can care for it. My closing thought is this. At 3.5 billion years old, this Lewisian gneiss rockery is older than all of us put together. It's seen a lot of change. It's survived our predecessors and it'll survive us. This is a form of comfort. Thank you.
Right. Tim, very well done indeed. Thank you very much. That was absolutely wonderful. I think I gave the vote of thanks to you when you spoke to the PPS. And I'm going to start with exactly the same words. Where do I start? And it's a fantastic overview of how so many photographers miss the point of what they're shooting. They miss the understanding. They go for what looks nice, and there's nothing wrong with that, but they miss understanding what is in the landscape. And I presume there are a number of archaeologists in the audience. And if you've worked in the field and walked landscapes, you will understand exactly what Tim has been talking about, that you can bore your walking companions immensely by talking about not just the geology, but also the archaeology of an area that you're going through. And it will, unfortunately, go over the top of the heads of many folk because it's very difficult to see. And what Tim is showing us here is that it's not, if you take the time to understand it, if you take time to become, as he rightly said, part of it, and not cherry pick when you go out, but simply go out, find out what it looks like. And if it appeals to your sense of curiosity and awe and wonder, then photograph it in a way that conveys that message. So once again, I mean, there were several things that I really liked about Tim's emphasis. Getting it right in the camera. Well, it's a very, very, it's an easy thing to say, and it comes from a time when folk thought that landscapes were more or less static. And in California and New Mexico and Arizona, you can often get that impression. And that's where this idea really comes from first, that photographs are a substitute for reality. But the reality, if it's poorly understood, then gives a misleading idea about the landscape. So Tim's first solution to this, to go out with a 50mm lens, is a wonderful piece of applied human psychology, because of course the 50mm lens mimics most closely the human field of view, minus the peripheral vision, of course. And that will give you a more humane view of the world in itself. And then this other wonderful idea, composing by areas. And I love that description of the river. There you see the river flowing very quickly and the rocks around it flowing a little more slowly. And I think that that really sums up a huge part of what we miss as photographers who work in the landscape. So this idea of composing by action, rather than using some abstruse and very difficult to understand rule of composition, that you balance light areas against dark areas and you balance this and you balance that. No, you don't. You look at a scene and think, I quite like that. Why do I like it? And it's that first interrogation that you make of yourself that's really important. Why do I like it? What is it that appeals to me? Is it that archaeology lecture I heard 40 years ago? Is it that geology lecture that I picked up when I shouldn't have actually been there? Is it, what is it? What is it about this that I really like? And part of this is, of course, that we're immersed in time. We don't really recognize the effects of time because we're medium-sized creatures in a medium-sized perspective. And all that Tim was saying reminded me of that rather wonderful pre-Socratic Greek philosopher Heraclitus, when he talked, as Tim did later, about not being able to step into the same river twice. And that was his illustration of the idea of being and becoming. And landscapes are always becoming something else, because as Tim rightly identified for us, they're constantly changing, they're constantly on the move. And we may not be able to perceive that very easily, but the landscape will do it nonetheless. And if you have a sympathetic view, an empathic view of the environment that you go out into, then you may well find that. So it's not about capturing a moment, it's about capturing a process, or saying, by implication, something came before this, this is what you see now, and something will change again in the future. So the photograph should always leave the viewer hanging and anticipating something else. And I particularly love the use of flare, Tim, because I have lost count of the number of times that judges in competitions have told me, flare, no, the flare, that really marked it down for me. But actually, of course, as you point out rightly, we see flare all the time in our eyes. Flare is a normal part of being out in the Scottish landscape, because of course we have so many clouds for it to peek through. Flare is wonderful. Flare emphasizes things. Flare shows us the flow and the movement of light. And landscape photographers would do well to listen to this as well. Plans sound impressive. I looked up this chart here, I looked up that chart there, off I went into the middle of the landscape, and lo and behold, it was exactly as I predicted. It's a little bit like becoming what is the word? I've forgotten the word. But anyway, it's a bit like making, Tim, help me, what's the word? Oh, jinx, never mind. And it's far better, far better to go out and accept the serendipity of what you're stepping into and the adaptability of it. And if you yourself are adaptable, well, heavens, you'll come up with some amazing photographs in the way that Tim does. So Tim also agrees with me. I know that single photographs don't tell stories. You have to tell the story around it. You have to have information before and after. And I agree with him. Yes, environment is probably the slipperiest word current in the English language. Not helped, I'm afraid, by primary schools, where environmental studies became a catch-all term for just about anything that you wanted to teach. And in that process, basic ecological understandings were lost. But I think Tim's photography and the way Tim approaches it allows all those ecological understandings to come back. So, do we take pretty pickies? Or do we take pictures with meaning? Well, there's nothing wrong with pretty pickies, and there's nothing wrong with using rules of composition, but they're not rules, they're just tools. And they may work in one circumstance, but they certainly won't work in another. They may work for you, but they might not work for someone else. I don't think they work for Tim, from what I can see. And I certainly know that for other photographers around here, they don't work either. But the important thing is to combine what you're doing and go out and find out about the place that you're going out into. It's not just a scene. And I think a large part of this may come back to something which Tim was alluding to. As urbanites, we go out into a place outside us. It's something out there to go into. But if you spend enough time in the landscape, it's not like that at all. It's like going home. So you leave your box and you go out into the real place. And then you leave the real place and you come back in your box because you don't want to be eaten by rampaging sheep or rampaging heeling coos. As we know, that's a constant problem. So, Tim, I'm not going to go on any further because I could go on for a huge amount of time. I'm just grossly impressed by the amount of research that you do to make your images come real. And I'm astonished by the way you've managed to put it together so succinctly. So if you could join me with a big round of applause for Tim, that would be lovely. Thank you, Tim, very, very much.
Malcolm, Colin had a question. I don't know if you've read it.
I did. And if I can find it again.
Shall I read it out?
Fine. Yes, go ahead then. Yep, that's fine, John.
This is to Tim. Do you find that your black and white images usually work in color and vice versa? In the days of film cameras, I shot differently and even chose completely different subjects according to whether I was using color or black and white. Woody Allen opposes the colorization of black and white movies for the same reason. He says they would have been filmed completely differently if in color.
Mm-hmm.
It's a good question. I mean, the way it works is that the camera shoots and stores the full color data. It's just that as you're waving it around, the preview screen on the back displays the black and white. It's not often about going out and taking a black and white image at the start. It's about the safety that I have at least one valid way of processing something. I will always try and get the colors looking as good as possible. The chances are, if I see a structure, then it's not just a line. It might be that, say, the sky is giving an area of solid blue or something like that. And that in itself forms a contrast against another aspect of the scene. And at that point, I'm composing by areas on a really good day. So that's a long way of saying I genuinely forget whether I've had the camera in black and white or color mode at the time of shooting. when I get back home, it's in color. I know there's something that I can get out of it. If it's full color again, then all to the good. If it turns out well as a black and white, then also all to the good.
Tim, have you heard of these flexible sensors that you paint the pixels onto? That they call it something like silver nitrate or something like that. And then you, when you finished shooting for the day, you pass it through some strange liquid which doesn't usually smell very nice. Have you heard of those kind of camera sensors?
It's ringing a bell, but from very dim and distant past.
Yeah, I agree with Colin. I think it makes a very big difference about.
Can do it. I mean, certainly, if the camera's in black and white mode, it does concentrate your brain on the structures and things, and you're not led astray just by, oh, look, it's a pretty shade of something.
Yeah, quite. Does anybody else have any questions?
Liz Lavery has said, thank you very much. She says it was beautiful. I don't know that she means you, Tim, but I think there's probably a part of you that she finds very beautiful.
Liz.
I mean, I thoroughly enjoy, I'm not a great one for photography myself, but you've changed my attitude to it by using it as a tool to learn about the world. I've not really seen that before.
Then this evening has been a success.
Probably my background in the arts, I tend to have been presented with photographs as artistic achievements, which your approach, I really, yes. I think I might take up a bit of photography.
Go for it.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I see there as being
club fees are very reasonable, John.
Yeah, well, no, I was just mainly going out with my, you know, taking snaps and then thinking why, looking at them and thinking, why is it like that? I do that sort of anyway, but with wildflowers and things, but it's, yeah, good. Thank you. I really enjoyed that.
Good.
Very impressive. Are there any more questions?
David, you'll have to unmute yourself.
Everybody can unmute themselves if they wish. I've given you power.
David?
Yes, here I am. Can you now hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now. That's grand.
Tim, you were talking about using a 15mm prime focus lens. And I understand the point that the discipline of having the fixed focal length and therefore the fixed field of view as a way of making you think about what you're looking at. But apart from that, do you find that you see a difference in the result as between variable focal length lenses and fixed focal length lenses in terms of number of layers of glass and scatter and so
on? These days, zooms are every bit as good as primes. And when I first got the current camera, I thought, let's try buying entirely primes and see how that goes, and walking around the landscape, and I hated it. The inflexibility of when you're walking around, you see a scene in front of you that you think looks nice, and what you see is the potential for the frame right up then and there. That's what you see, and you see the light, and you see the relationship spatially between the things in front of you. If you have to move yourself again in order to use the nearest prime lens, then you're not actually photographing the scene that you liked in the first place. So 90% of the time, I much prefer to walk around with 3 zooms that'll cover all the focal range that I could ever need. It's just, I'll use a prime if I'm in a very low light situation, so in the Suter Theatre or nighttime. But for reasons of sharpness or other light handling, I don't see much to be gained from it. Modern primes, like the ones that I bought, are technically perfect, but they lack soul. So I sold them all and bought a couple of lenses that do have soul.
Uh-huh.
That first image I showed of complexity with the autumn scene of the trees and slightly italicized and things, that was shot on a 40mm Voigtlander prime. And I actually tested before setting off, just holding it up against a plasterboard wall. If I change the aperture down 1 click, 2 click, 3 clicks, that gives a nice vignetting into the corners, just enough, not too much. And so not only did I walk around with a single prime lens on that afternoon and a 40mm, which is typical rangefinder style, but I was using a fixed aperture as well and just changing the focus on it.
Mm.
I found things that worked. I got that photo. So yeah.
Can I just say, Tim has just spoken heresy.
Good. Yay,
Yes. That's good. I mean, coming in the days of astronomy, when I was younger, in astronomical observation, you want as little glass as possible. That it's sort of a religion to have as few glass surfaces as you possibly can between you and what you're looking at, just because you've got so little light to play with. But evidently, for most terrestrial photography, that's not that critical now.
Well, in
David,
astronomical
I think
circles,
that's right.
you get achromatic versus apo refracted, and it's always better to have a triplet than a doublet. So I mean that's no longer a truism about the number of layers of glass either. It's better to split the light apart by color into chromatic aberration and then have another lens in the mix that will identify that particular phenomenon and fix it, than to settle for a compromise without the glass.
Yeah. I mean, certainly going back to what you said earlier about prime lenses, prime 50s are amongst the most researched and corrected lenses around, and yes, they can give that impression of being very sterile, but if you find the right one and it fits you and fits what you see, then it will be something you never put down again.
Well, it's the experience of the 50mm that I have, which is a Pentax 50mm 1.7. You've seen it in operation yourself.
Yeah.
It's an ancient thing that I got from JRS for a few tens of quid. But I love it for its own character and characteristics. So if I'm prepared to go out and shoot with just one thing, then that's the obvious go-to.
Yeah. David, again, was that, or you just?
I was scratching my head.
Okay.
Paul, I think Paul has a raised paw.
Yeah, I'm curious, picking up what John was saying about, well, I might try taking some photographs. And I'm just wondering how many PNS members who aren't members of the Photographic Society actually do find themselves taking photographs of the objects of their passion and interest without necessarily feeling the need to get too technically minded about the photographic aspect of what they're doing, but they're taking it as a form of record keeping or preserving the memory, or having a visual representation of things that they're either trying to study or explain to others. And I'm wondering whether they feel now that perhaps a greater interest in how to do that is going to help them in their other lines of inquiry.
The thing that struck me was that if you could take a beautiful photograph of something that interests you, you'd look at it and you think about the meaning behind that far more than just a snapshot. So I'm kind of getting into why technique is important. I knew that in other areas of life, and it's obvious. I'll say no more.
No, you're right, John. Are you trying to say that?
Yes, I think he was.
What I take from what you're saying is you're not trying to say there's a definition of beauty, but that the beauty is what you wish to see. Is that along those lines, or?
Well, yes, I guess. I mean, I think the geekiness of technique, okay, and the I don't know quite what I would say about pure art. Both those things kind of leave me a bit. Don't know what I'm trying to say. Well, I know what I'm trying to say, really, but yeah, I think technique is important for improving your ability to be able to look, to want to look at something, to come back to it, and to look hard. The idea of having a photograph of big lumps of rock on the Highland fault line, whatever you know, crunch zone, above your fireplace, and it is actually sort of amplified or enlarged 10 times over what it is or whatever. And it was just a lovely image, but you could start really reading into that image a lot about why it happened and what the forces of the earth and the plates and things, what's going on. And so it brings you back to learning. Whereas a snapshot kind of, you know, you look at it once and you say, oh yeah, well, that's a oxeye daisy or whatever it is, and it's growing in this, and that's growing next to it. Yeah, bang. And that's it. It just ends up in your portfolio. I think quality of the image is actually quite critical.
Yes.
If there's a message in it.
Mm-hmm.
There's an awful lot of beautiful images which are just, well, they're saccharine, to be honest. They're really technically good, but they're just saccharine.
Yeah. One of the things that I read many, many years ago in, how was it, Langford Basic Photography, I think it was probably. It was the idea that, so you take a camera on holiday, you go on the holiday of a lifetime, somewhere far afield, never to be returned again, and you want to take some photos to remember the occasion. You're not going to take lousy ones, are you? You want to do the scene as much justice as you can. And that's one of the guiding principles that I have. The bit where I was saying about getting it right in camera is not the end of the story for me. But get the camera bits right. It's because there is a whole workflow of getting yourself there, knowing something about what makes the scene in front of you interesting. Yay, rockery. And knowing how you want to handle it, having a goal in mind, but chunk, let's do the camera bits. Let's do the processing bits. Let's get the technique right while you're there. The art, in terms of processing, you might as well get that right as well. Because if it's going on your wall, you don't want to wake up tomorrow morning and say, oh, it's a bit dark. He's got a green hue all over it. What happened there? All this kind of stuff. Everything from start to finish has to be right. And that's in several ways. It's camera technique, processing, and sense of art, all have to come together. Then you have something that I'm happy with.
When I was younger, I used to, with the kids, my own children, when they were of an age, we used to go into a very dark bathroom with our Russian cheap, you know, bit of kit for printing black and white stuff. And I used to love that. I mean, that's just pure technique. It's tremendous fun.
So, yeah. Yeah.
It's actually the black and white printing is from film days. I mean, I had a phase of shooting film seriously, and I did up to medium and large format work. I even made my own system for doing enlargement prints in the bathroom by taking a large format camera and saying, well, light come in, light can go back out through the same lens again. Just stick a light box screen where the film went, and all of a sudden the light goes back out, projects onto the wall where a piece of photo paper is sitting blue tacked on the bathroom door, and that's your enlargement print for you. The funny thing is, a lot of textbook is all about you've got to absolutely nail your print production workflow so that you can reproduce the same print identically, tonally, compositionally, like a robot, stamping it out over and over and over again for everybody who wants to buy a copy. I found it was actually quite interesting being very loose and flexible about that, and saying, well, 16 seconds at f16 seemed to look quite nice, and I stirred it in the developer until it looked good. So I actually took the completely loose and non-technical arty approach to the darkroom.
So I think, I hang out with Tim a lot, and we take a lot of pictures together. I think more and more I'm beginning to realize that the technical aspects really are of minor consequence. All this F stuff and shutters and all that sort of, yeah. What really makes the difference is looking at a scene or an object and just looking at it closely and understanding, what am I seeing, and why am I taking this photograph, and what do I want the photograph to say? I think Tim's very good at that. And if you can't do that, then you end up with snapshots, no matter how wonderfully technically perfect they are. It's somehow being able to see that scene within your mind's eye when you're taking it, and understand, asking yourself, what does this mean? What is this about? Yeah. Does that make any sense? The technical stuff comes later. Yeah.
I'm not sure. I mean, it's like language. You're learning to speak the language of light.
Yes.
And as you become more experienced with the language, just like as we get older, we start communicating more effectively, or like some people, not sitting a million miles from this chair, having a brain full of all sorts of things, the communication becomes actually more difficult. But but yes, Tom, you're absolutely right. You can have the best equipment in the world and take absolutely inconsequential.
Absolutely. I think that you can do an awful lot with one of these little babies. Really an awful lot.
Yeah.
And yeah, a big camera, it's like, as Malcolm says, in communication, it's learning how to use big words, really. But you can communicate an awful lot with this little baby.
Tim, I've got a very serious question for you.
Mm-hmm.
Do your mum and dad still have painful memories of days when the bathroom was inaccessible?
Well, go on then, Mum. My film days came long after I left home, fortunately for everybody.
Coming back to Wal's question, which I think was about people who sort of use photography for a practical purpose without necessarily thinking of themselves as photographers. It happens that both Malcolm and I have spent a certain part of our lives photographing holes in the ground adorned with buckets and shovels and people's backsides. And there's a sort of, so yes, when you're doing that kind of photography, there's a kind of a minimum level which communicates what it is that you wanted to say, what you wanted to show, which often we don't achieve. And that I'm sure we both have long memories of going through people's photographs that totally fail to illustrate the point they intended. And then beyond that,
you're not including my photographs.
Oh no, far from it. Far from it. And then, so often you look at the photograph and think, if only they had taken that bucket out of the way, if only they had adjusted the light for the bit that's actually in shadow, and so on. But beyond that, there is a point where you would like to think, if we were just that little, or if I was that little bit better, there would be the point at which I wouldn't need a caption. The photograph would start to say what I wanted it to say, without me having to explain what it was I was trying to do. And so, yes, trying to improve one's techniques, at least to that level, even for that purely use of practical kind of photography, the recording buildings, recording holes in the ground, recording landscapes for historical purposes and so on, trying to get it to do what you want, and a little bit more than that, yes. We do find ourselves wanting to be at least slightly better photographers than we started out as.
Yeah, that's a very valid point, David. Yeah.
I think things got a little bit better for me when I was, well, they say I have spent 10,000 hours doing anything to get a grip on it. I don't know how long I've spent making photos over the last 20 years, but one of the key insights is the realization that what you see on the screen or in the viewfinder is what you want to turn into a print, 3 foot square on your wall or something. So if you're holding your phone or your camera and you're moving it around thinking, do I want this in my scene or what? Then thank you, Tom. Goodbye. Have a nice evening. Yep. Then what you see on the live view screen stands the potential to become a print or canvas or whatever kind of masterpiece. And if you're thinking to yourself, do I want this on my wall? Do I want this on my wall all the time? Then you very quickly don't make an awful lot of photos.
Yeah. Trial and error is really important.
I think I'll stop the recording now because it's getting quite just about up to 2 hours.
No, it is, isn't it? Yeah.